my fantastic Econ 112 students. I hope everybody's doing super well today and enjoying all this beautiful weather. Okay, let's just go ahead and jump right into it. So we covered chapter 5 last time, which went over a lot of our terminology as we're moving more into a public good perspective. Now that we're in chapter 6, we're going to talk about government actions in markets. So what can they do? Can they regulate on quantity? Can they install a tax? Can they install a subsidy? Are there different types of controls and pricing that government can do, such as government action? So we're going to start this off by looking at a price floor and price ceiling in the first video. And then in the second video, we're going to start talking about the implications of taxes in the system. So let's go ahead and share screen. Jump right into it. All righty. So what do I need you to know from this chapter to be successful in your future lives? 1, to be able to describe how rent ceilings create housing shortages. So this is one of the examples that we're going to work through to be able to look at what price ceilings are. We're going to be going through the examples of rent ceilings, essentially limits on rents, and what that means for the overall market when it comes to these different areas. Then we're going to look at minimum wage laws and talk about how they're related to unemployment. Then we're going to talk about the effects of taxes, so taxes and subsidies, and then so taxes and subsidies can either, increase or decrease the price. And then we're going to also look at the quantity side of the equation with production quotas and subsidies. And actually ignore the last bullet because I took that out because typically I would go into like how the markets for illegal goods work, but I realized that wasn't really very beneficial to y'all, so we just took that section out. Alrighty. So let's talk about housing markets with rent ceilings. This one I think is actually a really interesting example because it's something that's been debated lately within a lot of news articles and within a lot of different political movements. They're starting to talk about what happens with rent ceilings. Now, rent ceilings we've only seen in a couple places, right? We had them in New York, Toronto, Singapore, I think has a rent ceiling. I might not be 100% right on that. But what is the rent ceiling? A rent ceiling is just a type of price ceiling. Price ceiling is what we're really talking about, but I'm going to contextualize it in one example. So a price ceiling or a price cap is a regulation that makes it illegal to charge a price higher than a specific level. So I might say that, I don't know, there's a price ceiling on tea. You can only charge $3 for a glass of tea now. Well, okay, all right, okay. That means that we can't charge $3.50, we can't charge $3.75. It has to be below $3. Can we charge $2? Sure, that's totally fine. So price ceilings are looking at those relationships. When a price ceiling is put into the housing market, then it's called a rent ceiling. So this is the idea of telling landlords like, hey, you cannot charge more than $500 for this apartment or some similar thing. So this is setting an upper bound, right? And that can either be binding or it can be not binding. So let's say that we are putting a rent ceiling at $1,000. Well, if you already only pay $750 a month, if there's a limit of $1,000, that's not going to matter to you, right? That's not going to have an effect. But what if it went the other way? Let's say that maybe you're paying $1,250. So $1,250 for your rent. And then there's new rules saying that your landlord can't charge you more than $1,000. Well, this one's actually pretty interesting because what we're going to see is that they charge less, which means that there's ending up being a housing shortage because now the housing is much cheaper. Then we see that there's an increase in search activity because housing is cheaper. It now takes people longer to be able to find apartments. Then the black market starts to come in where people are like, hey, I know there's a housing shortage. You can't find an apartment. Let's go outside of the legal system. And if you just throw me $1,100 for this trailer I have in the back or something like that, we'll call it good. We're gonna go outside the legal system. These black markets appear. And it's actually really interesting because price ceilings and price floors are actually one of the main drivers of having these sorts of black market activities. So let's talk a little bit about that. What at the end of the day am I even talking about? Well, let's break down the graph. Actually, you know what? We're going to draw it because sometimes the best way to learn things is I found the tablet. Oh, okay. So let me give you the two situations that we could possibly see in this. Let's say that we have a housing market, right? So I'm going to give you two different graphs. So this first one's going to be this one here on the left, and then I'm going to give you one on the right. Sorry if this is always slightly crooked. I'm just very, very bad at figuring these out. So we know we have on our vertical axis our price. This is our price. This is going to be relative to the price in housing. And then we're going to have along the x-axis our quantity. This is going to be the number of apartments. Okay, well, what do we normally have in an equation or in our graphs? So we have our downward sloping demand. And you'll see why I'm doing two of these in a minute, because I'm going to give you two different situations. Downward sloping demand. So these are the people who are demanding housing, people who want an apartment, and we see that this decreases with price along with the law of demand, right? So when the price is really, really, really high up here, we see that we want very little housing because it's just too expensive. But if the price is next to nothing, well, then everybody wants an apartment because why not? It's next to nothing. So we see that we have that relationship of our downward sloping demand. Then in both of these, we're going to have an upward sloping supply. Here we go, upward sloping supply. These are the landlords, right? When the price is really, really low, they don't want to offer up many apartments. They're like, maybe I'll hold the apartments, or maybe I'll turn them into something else. So if I know apartments are going for next to nothing, maybe I'll sell this land to a landfill, or maybe I'll sell this land to an urban farming center. Okay, but if the price is really, really, really high, well, then they're like, I'm converting every extra room that I have into its own functional apartment, right? Unless you live in Edwardsville. So there's actually this weird rule in Edwardsville, and I'm not quite sure why this exists, but they have this rule where you can't have more than 3 unrelated adults living together. I guess it's because like maybe there were a bunch of houses that just had a ton of college students living in them, but now that's illegal to do. You can't have more than 3 living together, which is just kind of strange. So let's put in blue what our equilibrium price and quantity is. So let's say for both of these situations, if we left the market completely alone, apartments would be $1,000, and maybe we would have 500 apartments. I'm not quite sure if these are the exact numbers that are on the slides, but it's okay. We're working through an example. So $1,000 for 500 apartments. Okay. Now let's say that we're going to put in a price ceiling. So price ceiling means that I cannot go above that price. Well, let's say if we have situation 1, right? Situation 1, let's say that we have this right here, where we put in a new rule. The city of Edwardsville says, we are not charging students too much, you know, so there's going to be a rule. You can't charge them more than $12.50. Well, okay, this is our equilibrium right here. If we're already paying, here, green, if we're already paying 1,000, that's already less than $12.50. So that one's not really going to affect us all that much. This is going to be called a non-binding price ceiling. Okay, and then let's think of another situation. Let's instead say that we have this rule right here, where you can't charge more than $800. Well, this one becomes an issue, right? Because that's below this equilibrium price. So now we're like, oh no, okay, all right, well, let's figure out what happens. Let's figure out what happens. That means that we're going to start right here, and we're going to go along this line. And we go along this line, and which line do we hit first? Okay, this is supply. So the quantity supplied with the price ceiling, maybe that's going to be 300 apartments. Maybe there's only 300 landlords who are still willing to like rent out their apartment because they're not getting paid much. So the rest of them are like, I'll turn it into a studio space, or maybe I'll turn it into a working lounge, or maybe I'll just let my family live there rent free, right? So there's going to be less apartments. We see the quantity supplied goes down. All right, well, let's do this in orange. Let's keep going across. What's the next line we hit? Well, we hit demand. So it's come down, and we see that we have our quantity demand. Well, the quantity demand, maybe that's 800. That's because the price of apartments just went down. If the price of apartments falls, what happens to all the students on the SIUE campus? They're like, I could live in an apartment now. Why do I live in a dorm? I can afford an apartment. Let's go to an apartment. And then there's a lot more demand for the apartments at that point, right? Or there's more apartments that are demanded quantity wise. So we see that our quantity demand is actually above this equilibrium demand. In this case right here, we call this a binding price ceiling. There's one way that I really like to think about it. So let's imagine that we just have a little person. Let's say that what color? Purple? We have this little purple person. If this is a ceiling, that means, let's say that we have this person, he's holding up the ceiling because it's a ceiling. Well, the goal is to be able to get to this middle part. In this non-binding version, if we have this guy holding up the ceiling, he can walk over to this equilibrium. So it's not binding. That ceiling does not affect him being able to get there. Let's say that we have it on the other side. Let's say that we have this little person who's trying to hold up the ceiling. And the goal is to get right here to this equilibrium. Well, the ceiling's in the way, right? He can't make it there. He can't get to that equilibrium. That means it's a binding price ceiling. So that's one way that I kind of like to think about it contextually. So let's go back to the slides and what we're seeing there. In this one, what we find is that, oops. I went too far. What we find is we have the same situation, right? When we have a rent control of $800 and the equilibrium's at 1,000, we see that we have this lower quantity supply and this higher quantity demand than what our equilibrium would be. Now, there's two other pieces to this. First is if it's a shortage or a surplus. In this one, we see that we have a shortage. If it's below the equilibrium, the line is below the equilibrium and it's a ceiling, then it tends to be a shortage. What a shortage means is that there's just more people who want apartments, so there's quantity demand right here, than the number of apartments there are for people to rent. So this amount right here. This difference is called shortage. So in this example, we have 60 apartments that are able to be rented out and 100 people who want apartments. That means that the housing shortage is 100 minus 60. That means that there's 40 people who would like an apartment at this price, but can't get an apartment. Okay, all right, okay. Let's think a little bit more about this. Well, that means there's 40 people without an apartment. What if there's someone who they would have been willing to pay more than 1,000 and they really want one of those apartments, right? They would have been willing to pay like 1,200 and they really want one of those apartments. Well, what are they going to do? Well, maybe they go on the black market. So when we see this quantity supplied right here, and we take this intersection point of quantity supplied, or this quantity supplied and our rent ceiling, trace that with a little dotted line up to our demand. That is what people are willing to pay if there's only 60 available apartments. When there were 80 available apartments, there was a lot to choose from. Maybe they would have been willing to pay less, about 1,000. But now that there's only 60 apartments to choose from, they're willing to pay more because there's a couple cutthroat people who are willing to pay more money for those fewer apartments. So that means that we have this black market rent that comes in. It might be that, say, we have a landowner right here who knows that they can only charge someone $800. Well, what happens? Maybe they have two applicants. They have one person who's willing to pay them $800 and then another person who says, I'm really willing to pay $1,200 for this apartment. How about you charge me $800 through the legal pathways and $400 just shows up at your doorstep every month? That's a black market right there. That's an exchange that technically should not be happening, but it happens, right? And then these black markets come in, and the black market rent, the difference in between what people are willing to pay in the black market and the price that the government says there is just this difference right here. So this would be $400 at 60 apartments. We go up, we see 800 is where the price ceiling is. We continue to trace up to our demand. We see that's at 1,200. 1,200 minus 800 is 400, and that means that our maximum black market rent, the extra bit that people are willing to pay in a black market situation for that 60th apartment, is going to be equal to $400. Look at that! Look at that! So this is actually what we've seen all the time when we put in housing, our rent ceilings, which is why I'm very confused why that's the policy that people go for sometimes, because there's more efficient ways to keep you at the equilibrium price and quantity and still help people, right? But this is putting in an artificial limit where you can't necessarily get to that equilibrium price and quantity. So it's just something interesting to think about, is how a housing shortage arises in these situations. When we saw that we had rent control in New York back in the 1970s, there was a massive demand for housing. So people would live in those houses. They eventually got rid of rent controls, but then they said, okay, as long as the apartment's still in your family, you can stay to this rent control. But as soon as it moves to a new person, it has to go up to the original price. I don't know if y'all have seen the show Friends. I always thought it was a little ridiculous, the show Friends, because there was this woman named Monica who lived in this beautiful, just giant New York apartment, and she worked as like a chef with a friend who sometimes worked as a waitress and another friend who worked as a masseuse. They didn't make a lot of money, right? But somehow they afforded this massive apartment with a giant window in downtown New York. So they actually explain it in one of the episodes, and it's because technically the apartment's under her grandmother's name because it's a rent control apartment, which means that it stays to this rent system until it leaves the family and goes to someone else, and then the price would massively go up. It was still under the rent control, which is why they were able to have it. And that's also why a lot of people would really, really, really love that apartment for the price that they had it, but that it doesn't necessarily exist in the equilibrium setting. I always thought that was kind of funny. So with a binding rent ceiling, remember we have our binding level when the person can't get to the equilibrium, and we have our non-binding when the person can get to the equilibrium. With a binding rent ceiling, the quantity of housing demanded exceeds the quantity of housing supply. Let's go back. That just means that this QD right here is greater than the QD at 800 is greater than that 500. That's more than the equilibrium. It's also way greater than the amount that's supplied, which is this 300. In this example, there were 500 apartments in our housing shortage. Now there ends up being a shortage in housing. What happens when there's a shortage in housing? It's really, really good for the people who actually get an apartment at those prices, but we see that there's increased search activity. There's less apartments and more people that want them. It takes you much, much longer to find an apartment. Then we have the black market. A black market will end up arising in this situation because there's a housing shortage. There's more people who want an apartment than people than the apartments that are being rented, right? So with a binding, oops. And we see here, that's why we have the black market. Now, this black market rent, that's the maximum amount that can be spent on the black market, but it can also kind of show search cost. So it might be that these apartments cost $800, but there's only 60 of them, and there's 100 people who want them. So maybe that means that you're going to spend, you might be spending $800 on an apartment, but you also got to spend $30 in gas driving all over town looking for an apartment. And you got to pay another $100 in application fees because you have to apply to multiple apartments because you're just so competitive right now. And then maybe you also have to pay a little bit more in a deposit because that's another way that, maybe they decide that they can get a little bit more money out of this because there's less apartments for everyone. This difference can also represent search cost. So the amount above $800 that you put in finding an apartment that you would not have put in before the shortage, that's the idea of search cost. It's more costly to be able to go find the apartment to begin with. So we see that we have this increased search activity, the time spent looking for someone who to do business with, right? Finding a landlord, it takes longer if there's a shortage of apartments. So when prices are regulated and there's a shortage, this means the search activity increases. Search activity is costly, right? I'm sure that you all have filled up your gas tank about as many times as I have. Actually, probably way less. I've been driving longer than many of you. But okay, so search activity is costly, right? Driving around town, looking for an apartment for days and days on end, that's going to cost you a lot in gas. That's raising the cost. You're going to have to put in more applications. That's raising the cost, right? Search activity is costly, and the opportunity cost of housing is equal to the rent that you pay and the search activity cost. What you could have been doing with that money that you spent in gas, what you could have been doing with that money you spent in application fees, that opportunity cost plus the opportunity cost of rent, what else you could have done with that $800, that's the overall opportunity cost related to the search activity. All right, so because the quantity of housing is less than the quantity in an unregulated market, the opportunity cost of housing exceeds the unregulated rent. That essentially means, and sorry, I keep going back to these pictures over and over. That essentially means in this bounded one, so we have our non-binding on the left, nothing actually changes, but on the right, it is bound. That means that this difference, when we trace up to quantity supplied, if we continue to trace up to quantity demand, there's a difference in between what people would be willing to pay at that point. If there's only 300 apartments in this example, then people are willing to pay more for them than if there were 500 apartments available. So that difference, that's going to be related to our search cost or our black market. So black markets are just illegal markets which operate alongside legal markets in which a price ceiling or other restriction has been imposed. Why are there really sketchy people in New York with rent-controlled apartments, even though the family that originally had the rent-controlled apartment moved out ages ago? And why does Monica from Friends live in her grandmother's apartment that her grandmother's supposed to be living in but doesn't actually live in? Because black markets exist. Shortages in housing cause black markets all the time. So these are just illegal arrangements that are made in between renters and landlords. It's more than what you think, right? You're like, you think about black markets, you're like, ah, sketchy underground apartments. No, it's not. A lot of what black markets are is there's an apartment where you'll pay a legal amount for it, and then maybe you have to put a little bit extra into your landlord's mailbox, because there's another person who wanted that same apartment who wasn't willing to do that. So maybe they were more willing to lean towards your application, right? So when we start to add in these search costs and these black market activities, it actually works out. So even though we set the price at like $800, if we add in the search cost, we add in the bribes that you have to do to get one of those few apartments, the cost of the apartments and the rent control is actually more than what the equilibrium would be. That means that, for example, it's an $800 apartment and I spend an extra $400 in black market bribes and in the extra search cost and finding an apartment to begin with. That means that apartment really cost me $1,200 because it's rent plus everything else that I had to do. Now it's a $1,200 apartment over a legal change that we made to try to drop the price from $1,000 to $800. But because of the inherent shortage that happens in housing, we see that the people who do get the housing end up paying a lot more than what they would have made if we had just left it alone. So that's a really, really fascinating point to rent ceilings and any price caps. So in your homework and on your test, I give you two other examples. They go around the same way. They can either be binding or non-binding. And you have to look and analyze what that really entails. So there's a lot of inefficiencies that derive from rent ceilings, right? And price ceilings in general. If it's something that people are demanding, then a rent ceiling will create inefficiency. A rent ceiling set below the equilibrium rent, so the price and the quantity that would have existed outside of this. If we put the price lower, then that means the amount goes down that are being supplied and the amount that people want goes up, and now there's a disconnect in between the amount that's supplied and the amount that's wanted, and this is called a shortage. The marginal social benefit, so not just your personal benefit, the benefit of everyone. The marginal social benefit from housing services exceeds the marginal social cost, and a deadweight loss ends up arising. Let me show you what that means. It means that we have a situation that looks like this, where there's now an inefficiency that has occurred. Actually, you know what? We're going to draw it out, because drawing it out is always a better idea. I would consider, trying to draw this out on your own at some point. But let's remember what we learned about consumer and producer surplus last time. So here, we're going to get rid of this. We're going to just do the binding case again. So in this, we have our quantity. We have our price. We have our upward sloping supply. And we have our downward sloping demand. And let's say that we're still doing the apartment. So our equilibrium, here, I'm going to put quantity equilibrium so you know it's the equilibrium. I think I had that at how many apartments? Let's say 500 apartments. And then let's have the price at $1,000. And this is the equilibrium. Now let's say that we're in the binding case. So we're going to have, I'm going to put binding up here. In this binding case where we say, oh, you can't charge more than 800, just draw this line across. What we see is that our quantity supplied in this case is going to be less than the equilibrium quantity. And we're going to see that the quantity demanded is greater than the equilibrium quantity. So we know that this difference right here is called a shortage. Now, there's a couple other things that we need to realize. So remember consumer and producer surplus. Typically with consumer and producer surplus, we have it so that the top half of the triangle is consumer surplus. It's the difference between what I was willing to pay and what I actually paid. And the bottom is producer surplus. What I would have been willing to sell it for versus what I actually got. Now, what happens in this situation though? We see that there's this new inherent limit. So maybe the person who is willing to sell off the apartment for 200, well, there's a difference between 200 and 800. They're making producer surplus. Is not as much as if they were able to charge 1,000. They would have gone more producer surplus in that situation. So the amount of producer surplus goes down because we have this new limit, right? So let's call this producer surplus. Okay, then let's go to the next piece of this. The next piece is going to be analyzing the consumer surplus, right? So we see that this producer surplus, this is now much smaller than half the original triangle. Let's go up. Let's continue to trace this point, this intercept in between quantity supplied and supply, or excuse me, in between the rent ceiling and supply. Let's trace that up and we get to right here. On our demand. So this is where we would typically have our black market price, right? We're going to call this black market price. That's just the initial or additional amount above 800 that you would have to pay in bribes or an additional search cost and things like that. Well, if you're paying bribes and you're paying additional search costs, that means that this apartment's really costing you, let's say $1,250, right? So if I would have been willing to pay $1,500, but I'm paying $1,250, well, then I still get some economic benefit, right? There's still some surplus for me. I'm still paying a lower price than what I've been willing to pay, but that's not the same difference as it would be between $1,500 and $1,000. If I was willing to pay $1,500 and I'm really paying $1,000, that's a real good deal. But if I'm willing to pay $1,500 and paying $1,250, that's an okay deal. So I see that my consumer surplus, this amount up top, you're just going to try to fill it in. Consumer surplus. This is also reduced. Notice that this is smaller than what half the original triangle would be. Now let's figure out what these other two pieces are. Well, we now see that we have this rectangle right here that has been created. It is so hard to just fill things in online. All right. This right here, these are potential losses from search. Potential, I'm not good at spelling, from search or black market price. This is the amount that people are losing because they're having to bribe landlords. Or they're potentially losing. They're potentially losing. It may not happen every time. This is the amount that you might lose having to bribe landlords. This might be the amount that you might lose because it's going to take you 5 more tanks of gas to find an apartment. This is the potential that you lose because you had to put in 4 different applications because the apartments kept filling up so fast. That's what this square represents, or rectangle. Technically, it's almost always a rectangle. All right, then we have one more piece. Notice that I didn't tell you what's happening with this triangle right here. Well, this triangle, notice that this is a loss in consumer and producer surplus. So we have a smaller consumer surplus. We have a smaller producer surplus. We have this potential losses from search or black market. So that's just also loss or potential loss in total surplus. But this right here, this special triangle, this is called deadweight loss. This is the loss to the economic system because there are not enough apartments compared to what the equilibrium would be, right? So if we have only 300 apartments, when the equilibrium would have been 500 apartments, that means that we're losing every trade that would have happened between 300 and 500 apartments. That 350th apartment, that trade's not happening. So there's no person who's going to be happy with their producer surplus, and there's no person that's going to be happy with their consumer surplus. That 455th apartment, no longer getting sold. So there's no one to get producer surplus, and there's no one to get consumer surplus. So this triangle right here is called deadweight loss. It's a very, very important concept. So I would pay attention to that. So back to Back to the lecture slides. So we see that rent ceilings end up decreasing the quantity of housing. Well, when there's a decrease in the quantity of housing, that means that this triangle exists, because there's now, in this example, the difference between 60 apartments and 80 apartments, those aren't getting sold anymore. So no one's benefiting from it. So we end up getting this gray triangle of deadweight loss. This is loss of that bit of happiness from getting a good deal. It's that loss from someone paying you more than what the thing you're selling is worth. It's the loss to society of these surpluses. These deadweight losses, they arise. Notice that the triangles of producer and consumer surplus get smaller. That extra bit of happiness people get from good deals, that's going down. That extra bit of happiness that someone's getting because someone's paying a lot for their product goes down. And now we have this rectangle of potential losses to search activity, black market, and a bunch of other things. So are rent ceilings fair? Because remember, we had talked about this last time. We have the idea of equity, and then we have the idea of fairness, right? So and we had our two types. We had the fairness and the rules. So we make sure that everybody starts in the same position. You have the same amount of money, you have the same amount of education, you have the same amount of everything else, and that's the idea of fairness, and what happens after that is up to you. Then we have the idea of fairness and results. Doesn't matter where you started, and we're not going to necessarily give you the same thing to start with, but at the end, we're going to take everybody's stuff, put it in a pile, and then divide it evenly. Remember, these are the two extreme ideas of fairness. Now, there's lots of things in between that might be overarching. According to the fairness and the rules, and starting everyone out from the same point, a rent ceiling is unfair because it blocks voluntary exchange. So if I'm making sure that everybody starts with the same amount of money and the same amount of education and the same amount of everything else, well, then putting in a rent ceiling keeps voluntary exchange from happening. The people who actually would be willing, because they all have the same amount of money, and maybe they have $10,000, and someone really, really, really wants to pay $900 for an apartment, and someone really wants to sell it for $900, but that's not allowed anymore. Well, then that goes against the fairness and the rules, because you're not allowing those people to do the thing that they want to do. Let's think about the fairness and results. Fairness and results, where we put everybody on the same playing field at the end, and we say, okay, we're going to give you the same money. We took everybody's assets. Good job working on those, but now we're going to divide it evenly in between you. Well, in that result, rent ceilings are also unfair, right? Because it doesn't generally help the poor. The point of the fairness and the results is so that the people who are in really poor or impoverished situations get raised up so that they have similar levels of happiness and well-being and surplus to everybody else, right? But the problem is, this sort of policy, a rent ceiling, doesn't necessarily benefit the poor, because yes, it might be a lower rent price, but now you have all this extra cost of having to find an apartment, and there's less apartments around for poor people to move into, and only the rich people are going to have the money to bribe people, and only rich people are going to have the money to pay for the 6 things of gas and to miss work to apply for apartments and to put in all these applications, and poor people don't necessarily, right? So rent ceilings, price ceilings in general tend to be unfair, both if we think about the rules to begin with, and if we think about the end result, because it doesn't necessarily help the poor in that one. So rent ceilings decrease the quantity of housing, because, well, we've seen why, right? So there's a couple different ways that these houses would be distributed, and a lot of it has to do with how this housing is allocated. So there's either lottery systems. If everybody puts in an application that's really expensive and I just kind of draw one out and they get the apartment, well, then it's costly for all the other people who have to go put in another application now. There's also the idea of first come, first serve. First person to knock on my door, they get the apartment. Well, that means that everybody's taking off work that day and they're rushing over, which means they're losing wages, and then they're losing that money on gas. That's kind of another inefficiency that happens, right? And then there's discrimination. So it might be that landlords will strongly prefer to rent to the rich person who's willing to put a bribe in their mailbox relative to the poor person who's not willing to put a bribe in their mailbox. So it creates a lot of scarcity in an unfair and biased way. So let's talk about the other side. So we've talked about price ceilings now, but what about the idea of a price floor? So what is a price floor? A price floor, hold on, tea. I need that caffeine. All right, a price floor is a type of regulation that makes it illegal to trade at a price lower than a specified level. This is the idea of saying, okay, you can sell hard drives, but you can't sell hard drives for less than $20, $30 because we don't want to put the hard drive makers out of sale. You can buy all the wheat you want, but you can't sell the wheat for less than $1.50 because we don't want to put all the wheat farmers out of work. Minimum wage. Minimum wage is actually the one that we're going to talk about in this situation. It's putting a price floor to wages, right? You can't pay someone below a certain amount. Well, what does that mean in the big picture? It means that you can either be above or below what the equilibrium wage rate would have been, right? So this one's actually also really interesting because this is something that's coming up a lot right now in the news. There's a lot of different cities that are changing their minimum wage. There's a lot of different states that are changing their minimum wage. There's different groups who are for it and there's groups who are against it. So let's look at what the economic implications of minimum wage are. You know what? We're gonna start by drawing this out. Don't save. Okay, so much like the price ceilings, price floors, I'm going to give you two different graphs. So let's have graph number 1, whoops, and graph number 2. We're going to have our quantity, price, supply, demand, supply, demand. Okay. And so this one might be confusing because I think some people get a little confused when it comes to minimum wage, which side's the supply and which side's the demand. So demand in this situation are the people who want to hire, right? They're demanding labor. And the higher the price of this labor, the less that they want at those prices, right? And the supply is the people that want to work. So they're selling their labor. So they're supplying their labor. I know that that one tends to confuse people. So I just wanted to make it very, very clear. Okay, now let's look at the two equilibriums, our equilibrium in both of these. Assume that these are actually the same level. I'm terrible at drawing. Let's say that in equilibrium, we have 1,000 people who are employed, and they're employed at a wage of, I don't know, let's say $11. Okay? So 1,000 and then $11. Okay, now let's see what happens when we put in a price floor. When we tell people that they cannot pay someone less than a certain amount. Well, let's say that we tell them that they can't pay less than $10. Well, if you're already making $11, that minimum wage is going to be less than what you're already getting paid. So does it matter to you if minimum wage goes to $10 if you're already making $11? Maybe not. Let's go ahead and trace this over. Now, similar to the one that I said earlier, remember that I had a little dude holding up the ceiling for price ceilings? And price floors, I'm going to have a person standing on the floor. Can this person walk to this equilibrium? Yeah, he totally can. This is good. That means that this is a non-binding price floor because you're already making more than that in equilibrium. So it doesn't really matter that we put in this minimum wage, right? Let's go to the binding example then. Let's say that you're making $11 or the price for labor is about $11. Now let's put in a new rule that says that you have to pay people $15. Well, that one's going to matter, right? Because you're making 11 and now there's a new rule that they can't pay you less than 15. Well, that means that there's something's going to happen. So right here, let's put our little dude standing on our price floor. Can he walk down to that equilibrium? No, he cannot because he's standing on a floor and that floor prevents him from getting there. Now, what do we see in this situation? Well, let's go ahead and let's trace along. So at $15, we start to go across. The first line that we hit is this demand line, right? let's go down. This is the demand for workers. So the number of companies that want to hire people at $15. Well, maybe at $15, this quantity demand, this maybe, let's say it's 500. They only want 500 workers. Well, this is less than that equilibrium quantity. Okay. Okay. All right. So our quantity demand is less. There's less jobs than what would have happened if we had just left things alone. Now let's keep going across. And we see that we eventually hit the supply side. So let's trace that down. And this is our quantity supplied. This is the number of people that want to work. Because maybe you didn't want to work at $11, but now the price is $15. Like, you can take some hours off studying for $15. Like, you're pretty happy with that. So maybe there's 1,500 people that want a job at this new wage. That's above what the equilibrium quantity would have been. Well, see, the thing is, we see a couple pieces here, right? We see that our quantity demand is less than our quantity supplied. That means that there's less jobs than there are people who want the jobs by a significant amount. So this difference right here, this is going to be called a surplus. That means that there's more people wanting to work than jobs to hire them. There's a surplus of labor in the market. So with this surplus, what does this minimum wage actually mean, right? Because that's been the big question. What does this actually mean? Especially in politics right now, people are like, oh, well, if it's a non-binding minimum wage, who cares? Because wages are above that. And then if it's binding, they're like, oh, well, this is going to cause issues. Well, some of the issues that we see is now that the surplus exists, right? So for the people who make the $15 an hour, the people who get the raises, they're really, really happy, right? They're like, yeah, I'm making more. But the thing is, the amount of jobs for these people making more, these 500, it's really good for that 500 people. But now the number of people that want to work is 1,500. That means that we have 1,000 people who want to work that can't work because no one will hire them. So it's not good for them, right? Minimum wage is great for the people who get to keep their jobs, but it's not necessarily good for the people who want jobs, but don't have them currently. Oh, okay. So with this price floor, we see that there's a regulation in the market because we're talking about government actions, right? Which are different types of government rules and regulations that can be put in. A price floor is a regulation that makes it illegal to trade at a lower price. When it's applied to a labor market, so in the example that we just used, that's where we get a minimum wage. Minimum wage is actually honestly one of the most interesting examples, but I do have different examples on your tests and on your quiz, or not on your quiz, on your homework. If the minimum wage is set below the equilibrium wage, so if you're making $11 and the minimum wage is set at $10, then it doesn't matter. There's no effect that happens there because you're already making more. If the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium wage, well, then it has powerful effects, right? More people want to work, but there's less jobs for them to work. So this is something that we have to think about very, very, very carefully when we're starting to put in different types of rules. Minimum wage ends up causing unemployment in those ways because, like I said, it's great for the people who continue to make $15 an hour. That's awesome, and I'm very, very happy for them. But what we do see is that this new quantity demanded for labor is less than the equilibrium quantity, right? Which means that there would be a reduction in the number of jobs on our graph, which means that there's unemployment that's introduced into the system. So if we have this quantity supplied by workers that's more than this quantity demand, we have this surplus that's created. When we have a surplus in a labor market, that means that the legal wage rate cannot necessarily eliminate the surplus, which means that there's an unemployment in the system of people who would like to work but can't work. So we see this illegal region, and imagine that we have a little person standing on our floor, they're walking around, they can't get to this equilibrium, which means instead we have that surplus. All right, so let's give a couple examples, right? Let's say the quantity of labor supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. This is the idea of our binding minimum wage. So in this example, the minimum, or we would normally make $9, and 21 million hours a year of people working would happen at $9 an hour. But now the minimum wage is $10 an hour. Okay, well, what happens? We see that there's now a demand for only 20 million instead of 21 million workers, but 22 million workers want to work as opposed to 21 because they're like, hey, that's a higher wage. That'd be great. Well, if there's only 20 million jobs, at 20 million jobs, let's trace down to the supply. Well, if there's only 20 million jobs, if people know that there's a shortage, what would they do? Would they be willing to take a lower rate? They're like, oh, wow, there's not many jobs. Okay, you can pay me slightly less because I really need one of these jobs. Well, then maybe at that point, if we're looking at our supply of labor, the supply or the quantity supplied of labor at $8 would be about this 20 million. So at 20 million, people would be willing to accept $8 for their labor at that point. Now, is minimum wage fair? That's a very interesting question. Minimum wage rate in the United States is set by the Fair Labor Standards Act. We've seen in 2009 that it was raised to $7.25. I think before then I used to make like $5.15 and then I went up to $7.25. I used to work for minimum wage about the time that all these changes happened. But minimum wage hasn't changed in years. But now a lot of economists figure that it might not even be a binding minimum wage anymore because very, very few jobs actually pay people at the minimum wage. So now this minimum wage rule might be below what the equilibrium price and quantity is. So we have to think about, well, what's going to happen if we raise the minimum wage rule? What are the economic implications for that? If it's still below the equilibrium, then it has no effect. If it goes above the equilibrium, people get paid more, but now there's a shortage in jobs. So this is a very interesting dichotomy. It also has a lot of implications because some states have set their minimum wage above this, well, some have not, but also cost of living is very different. It's much more expensive to live in Los Angeles, where the price of rent is 3 times the national average, than it is to live in a rural town in Mississippi where you can get rent for $300-400, but there's no jobs there. So the cost of living is very different, which means if we have just one federal minimum wage, it's going to affect some places like rural Mississippi, but it's not going to affect other places like San Francisco or Los Angeles at all. So that's one of the difficult parts of even installing a national minimum wage, is not everywhere in the nation's the same. So then comes the idea of, should states set it? Should local governments set it? You know, that's a very contested question. And then it's up to us to use our mathematical skills and our economic logic to try to approach this problem so that we can think instead of those nominative statements of feelings, and instead have positive testable implications where we try to figure out what the economic impact of these things could be. So most economists, okay, 99.5% of economists believe that minimum wage laws actually increase unemployment rates of low-skilled young workers or people that work part-time. So, which means that there's an inefficient outcome, right? Because we're not at the equilibrium where demand equals supply anymore. We're somewhere beyond that, where demand may not, or the quantity demand may not necessarily match the quantity supplied, which means there's either a shortage or a surplus. In this case, there's a surplus if we're talking about a binding price floor. Whew, that's a lot of stuff to go through, right? So what happens when it comes to the idea of deadweight loss in these situations? Well, here, we're going to go ahead and draw out that one too. I know I'm drawing a lot in this one. You're actually, this entire second portion of the class is a lot of drawing. All right, so let's say that we have quantity. I'm not writing it all out this time. Price, supply, demand. We have our, let's say, equilibrium quantity. Let's say that's 1,000 people employed, and we have our equilibrium price. Let's say that that's $10. And then we're going to put in our binding price ceiling of, let's say that this is $15. Okay. All right. Let's talk through the different parts. If it's $15, well, what happens to the consumer surplus? Well, there's this company that would have been willing to hire you for 17 and they get to hire you for 15. They still get a little bit of happiness. There's this company that would have been willing to pay you $15.50. They pay you 15. They still get a little bit of extra happiness. This right here is our consumer surplus. Notice that this is much smaller than half the triangle that might have originally existed. Now let's continue to go down. All right, so let's trace this line down and see where we interact with supply. Well, okay, where we interact with supply, we see that we have, oops, let's go ahead and pull this over. let's say that maybe getting one of these jobs is a lot harder now, right? So you're making $15 an hour, but you might have to drive even further to your job. So maybe your real wage is like $12. It goes down because you're losing part of that $15 to driving further for your job because there's less jobs. So you're driving like an hour now. Okay. And then maybe there's a little bit of extra costs. So you had to put in a lot of applications, a lot of time, go on a lot of interviews, buy multiple outfits for multiple different interviews. And because it was a really, really long and tedious search. So that's even more money that you're losing from that $15 that you're putting into that search cost. Then maybe you told your employer, like, look, I know you're sketchy, but I really, really need this job. So maybe I'm willing to take, maybe you pay me the legal wage, but like, I'm going to give you some of it back in like fines, or maybe I'm going to give you some of it back in like a payment to be able to work that night. So there's a black market approach. Well, okay, then what you're really walking home with, you might be making $15 on your paycheck, but when we subtract all these extra costs that you have, maybe you really only make like $8 after those costs. So if you were willing to work for $4 and you're making $8, you're happy. If you're willing to work for $7.50 but you're making $8, you're happy. So we have this smaller producer surplus that happens here. The people who are producing the labor, now they have to put in a lot of cost to that search cost and black markets. So their real wage has actually gone from $10 to $8. Like the amount after they pay everything and after all these additional costs, what they really have is $8 when they could have made 10 before. So their producer surplus has shrunk. Consumer surplus of businesses that would have been willing to like pay a lot has now shrunk, right? Because they're having to pay a lot more. So what do we see here? Let's do red next. We see that we have this amount right here, this rectangle, and I did make this rectangle really big just so we can kind of see it better. This is our potential losses. This can be to search costs. This can be to black markets. So working illegally for a lower wage. This can be all the costs that you have having to search for jobs for much, much longer. So on and so forth. And then what else happens? Well, notice we have this triangle again. Whenever you see a triangle, you should go ahead and think, this is dead weight loss, right? Dead weight loss. This is loss to the economic system. This is the person who would have been willing to work for $9.50 and the company that would have paid them $10.50. That trade's not happening anymore, out of the system. This could have been the person who was willing to work for $8.50, but they're really getting paid $13. That trade right there, out of the system. This is just the collection of loss in economic benefit to society. All the total surplus, which is the producer surplus, consumer surplus, that's lost because these trades don't even happen to begin with. Why is that? Well, that's because there's less jobs now, right? Less jobs. But there's more people who want to work them. More workers. So there's a disconnect, and this happens. Isn't that kind of neat? I think that that's kind of neat. So this deadweight loss arises, which means that there's a potential loss from increasing the job search, which decreases both the worker surplus and the firm surplus. Whew. Okay. Taxes is actually the next video, which means you have finished the material for the first part of this. I do tend to have a lot of graph-related questions and a lot of theory-related questions on that early material of price ceilings and price floors. If you are concerned about it at all, or you do not understand, you need to come by my office hours because it's a really, really crucial part to understanding the second portion of this. All right, get up, stretch your legs, stretch a little bit, and we're going to come right back to the next video afterwards.